Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the informational session today on the Semantic Model Information Elements request for industry comment. All of the lines will be muted, and we ask that participants add questions to the chat throughout the presentation. The panelists will respond to those questions during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Also note that this session is being recorded and will be made available for replay after. We will send out those links and add them to the BPC website accordingly. And now I will turn it over to our presenter, Todd Albers. Go ahead, Todd.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining today's session on the informational and question and answer session on the Semantic Model Information Elements. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to sit and listen. And the point of this meeting is to provide you with the opportunity to ask us questions. The work group who has assembled the form that we're asking feedback from, as well as to provide a little bit of an overview of not only the semantic data model that we're working on, but also this concept of an e-invoice exchange framework. And so for our agenda today, I'll first touch on the Business Payments Coalition and the exchange framework to give some context of why we're going down this road with the semantic model and this request for industry comment. And then we're going to provide some instructions on how to fill out the form and give the community the opportunity to answer questions, ask questions, and for us to provide answers. We'll also touch on the activities of the Business Payments Coalition and the timeline of the activities as we work towards developing not only the semantic model, but also other components of the exchange framework. And then we'll conclude with an overview of the data model and flow. I'll ask one of the presenters with me, Ken Holman, to walk through some tools that are available for folks to use to validate some of the information, if you will, that the model has created. So that's our agenda today. As far as introductions, Chris introduced me. Thanks for that. My name is Todd Albers. I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis in the Payment Standard and Outreach Group. Joining me today are several different subject matter experts that are coming from the e-Invoice work group. We have Michael Jasper, who's a director at Velocity Procurement. We have Ken Holman, who's Chief Technology Officer for Crane Softrights from Canada. And we have Jesus Pastran, CEO of ATEV Mexico. I just want to stress, we've got representations from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and together, this represents a significant trading bloc between the three countries. In that, when we talk about interoperability, a lot of U.S. companies who do trade cross-border have the need to be able to send invoices between the three countries, and so. The semantic model is more than just a U.S. Invoice standard. It would essentially be a North American standard. And so we want to get that across to the audience that this is encompassing these three countries from a trade perspective, and we have representation from those areas. As I move into the next slide, who is the Business Payments Coalition? The Business Payments Coalition was formed in 2011 and is around 850 plus members strong. It is an internationally recognized group of industry experts from corporates, financial institutions, service providers, and standards bodies who work on initiatives that support the adoption of electronic business-to-business invoices, payments, and remittance data exchange, leading towards increased B2B payment efficiency. Now, the BPC is free to join, and it's open to anyone who's interested in these topics. If you want to contribute your time, talent, and expertise, there's a link on this slide deck here that'll bring you to the BPC website. And so from an e-invoicing standpoint, the BPC is coordinating this multi-year initiative with industry stakeholders and to assess and provide requirements and recommendations for an electronic invoice exchange framework for the U.S. and North American market. So the next item I want to touch on is what is an e-invoice exchange framework? The exchange framework, if you start taking a step back at what most connection models look like amongst businesses, quite frankly, it's a mess. It's how businesses connect with one another is standing in the way to fully automate the invoice processes. And it requires you to manage many different processes and models and providers where you're onboarding and offboarding from different platforms, solutions, tools, and applications. The point is that this is a barrier where a lot of businesses have to face when they try to automate. And so the question is, can you change this current connection model, and how can you shift the connection model paradigm? And so when you take into the current connection model and create one where can e-invoicing, for example, be as simple as emailing? And I'm not talking about emailing invoices. What I'm talking about is there a connection model that can shift how businesses connect and send electronic invoices in a simple, cost-effective way without requiring you to prioritize who you connect to digitally? And is there a model where you don't need to push your trading partners into solutions that automate one side of the process but create manual process to the other side? And so when I start thinking about what are some of the models we could look at to help businesses exchange electronic invoices, the first one I look at is email systems, quite frankly. And the reason why I look at email systems is that at one time, email systems did not interoperate with one another. If you were on one email tool and my trading partner was on the person I want to send the email was on another tool, we couldn't necessarily email each other. We had to be on the same tool. And this was especially true in the early 90s. Then the email system providers came together. They created an exchange standard that enabled various email tools to interoperate with each other. So it doesn't matter now if I'm on Microsoft Exchange, for example, and somebody is using Google email. We can exchange emails between us without having to worry about how we connect with each other. So all I need is my email address. Another model we can take a look at is cell phones. And cell phone systems at one time didn't communicate. They didn't interoperate with one another. What that meant was that if I was on a certain type of cell phone, and you were on another type of cell phone, we couldn't necessarily call each other. And this was especially true from international calling. So depending on what type of cell phone I had, it really determined who I could call. And so the communication industry came together and created a set of exchange standards that enable cell phones to interoperate with each other. So it doesn't matter if I'm on one cell phone type or if you're on another cell phone type, I can call you anywhere you are in the globe and make that connection. And to do that, all I need is your cell phone number. So these are just two examples of how the market came together and simplified the connection model. So can this be applied to businesses, for example? So if I were to take a look at, what would this new connection model look like? So we would start simply by where a business would connect to a service provider and have that one connection. And then service providers would connect with each other. And so by doing this, the service providers, through this connecting with each other, create this exchange framework. And that exchange framework creates the set of standards for them to interoperate with each other in order for them to exchange electronic invoices. And this creates a network of networks. And it allows one business to connect once and exchange with anyone else across all participants and service providers that are in this framework. And the service or access providers can be B2B networks. It could be your AP or an AR solution, for example. It could be an ERP provider. It could be even a bank. The point is that the service and access providers are using a standardized way to connect with each other while servicing their customers in a unique way to sending and receiving invoices. Now, this isn't something new that was created out of thin air. These exchange frameworks have been around in other markets and have been proven to be an effective way to move invoices and other supply chain documents. For example, one of those frameworks is one called PEPL. And PEPL is a framework for businesses to send electronic invoices in Europe to different European government entities. Now, PEPL is starting to expand outside of Europe, but the point is that PEPL has been around for a number of years. I think it's around 10 now. And they have many different sellers that are on their framework, and they're sending invoices to their government customers through that. Another example is one called the European Codex framework. Now, Codex leverages the same technology standards as PEPL, but it's used to transmit legal documents securely across national borders. And another example is e-Freight project. The e-Freight project is being used in intermodal movement of goods globally. Again, e-Freight leverages a similar set of technology standards in order for the transmission and process of a document such as customs declarations and invoices between shippers, carriers, and port operators. So these are just a few examples of exchange frameworks that are being used to move electronic or digital documents and messages between the endpoints. And in the case of invoicing, we're looking at how do you move an invoice between a seller and a buyer in a common way. So in order for this new connection model to exist, you need the framework that outlines the set of prescriptive standards, the policies, and guidelines that address the legal, business, semantic, and technical requirements for businesses to connect once and exchange an electronic invoice with others. It is a way for the market can address these connectivity issues that every business has to address in order to improve their automation efforts. Now, the focus of this information and Q&A session is on the semantic component of the framework. The Business Payments Coalition has been looking at this and is addressing some work with the technical side, and we'll be looking at the legal side of this later on, and I'll talk about that or touch on that when I go through the other activities that the BPC is doing. But again, this session is focused on the semantic component, and the semantic component is important because it facilitates this common understanding between the seller and buyers in the data that is exchanged between them. A semantic data model reduces the complexity and the cost in the data exchange between the service providers, while the service providers maintain their ability to differentiate between themselves with their connections to their sellers and buyers in the model. Additionally, to move the data, you need a common syntax, which is the set of rules that define how the semantic data model information elements are structured in a machine-readable format. So the purpose of the review of the information element on that form is to identify all of the different data elements that is needed to facilitate this common understanding between what's called corners 2 and 3 in this exchange framework. So what is the e-Invoice semantic model? The semantic model creates this common understanding of the information exchange between the parties, ensuring semantic interoperability between parties in the exchange framework. The semantic model components consist of several different things. One is that there's common invoice business processes between sellers and buyers. The model defines what those business processes are. It defines the business functions that are involved in processing an invoice, such as accounting, procurement, shipping, for example. It defines the actors and roles involved in the invoice business processes from both a seller and a customer perspective. And it also defines the information model as well as the data model. So the information model is the items that you're trying to transmit be it an invoice number, be it a customer address, to the buyer, for example, when they're processing their invoices internally for automation, as an example. And the data model is the expression of the information model into that syntax so that it can be read by another machine. So that is what the e-Invoice semantic model is. I'm going to transition now to the comment form with that background in mind. And in the comment form, we have different sections. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to see the comment form or reviewed it. And if you have not, what the next few slides will be just providing you some background and instructions on how to go through it. So step one is that you can go get this comment form from the Business Payments Coalition website. It's underneath the e-Invoicing section, and I think it's the top thing on the list right now. So you can go ahead and download that either in a Word document form or a PDF. And so the first thing is you want to save and retitle the document. And I would recommend using either your name or your company name in that retitle so that when those are received, that is used, that can uniquely identify those different filled out forms. The next thing is to go to section 6 of the information elements request for comments. And this is an interactive form. We ask you to review each information element and the related information to it, such as what are the business rules, the cardinality, meaning is it required or optional, and then determine what kind of change that you're suggesting and if you have any comments. Now, for the suggested change side of it, there is a drop down where you can choose an item from a list of that change, of the one that is applicable that you would like to see. And then there's this comment field where you have the ability to provide comments related to that particular information element and change. Now, you don't necessarily have to identify a change. You could add a comment that says, well, we use this field, for example, in this manner, or we need this field if, for example, it's not listed for this business process as we process our invoices internally. And so there is additional section within the form, section 7, for you to add these different suggested information elements. Now, one of the other things that we would like to see, or not like to see, but recommend is that as you're filling out the form, it may make sense for you to partner up, if you're on the business side or if you're on the technical side, partner up with your business or technical subject matter expert and review the form jointly to provide feedback. Because I think both, when you partner together, it provides you a better, you can provide that context with one another on what is the business side of it or what are the technical side as I look at the information elements. So that is the first part of providing feedback on the form, walking through the different sections. Now, as far as other information within the form, we do provide a table that has the definition. So the form basically has it laid out in a table format, and these are the column headers. And the first item on that table is an identifier that we're using internally within the work group as a cross-reference between what we've identified for the North American model and how it relates to other models. So, for example, here we list the model that's being used in Europe. And so we can see where there's commonality between the two and where there's uniqueness for the North American model. Then there's the information element, and this is the data that's associated with the invoice. And it's pretty self-explanatory when we start looking at the form itself. What are the rules around that? So when the rule is invoked when the corner 2 sends the invoice to corner 3, and that ensures that the rule is met in that exchange. And then the cardinality, is it a mandatory field, which is a core set of information, or is it optional? Is it an optional information element that isn't required but can be passed through? Now, some optional fields can be mandatory. when we're providing it, when it's being provided. And so it is dependent on whether or not the information is presented in the earlier, let's say, element, for example. And then the suggested change drop-down and comment field. So those are the way the form is structured and the different components of it. And then section 5 is just the instructions on how to fill out the form. But to provide some context for you, I said earlier that the semantic model consists of business processes, and what we've done so far is we've identified 13 business processes, invoice business processing that the model needs to cover. We've completed the review of the 5 most common processes so far, and are fairly confident that the model and the information that's being presented on the industry comment form is representative of most invoicing data scenarios or requirements. And we are currently under or in review right now some other business processes that are around when invoices are being delivered with either a prepayment or spot payment or a payment in advance of delivery, invoices that have references to dispatch advices, cancellation or corrective invoices, partial and final invoicing, and self-billing invoices. So those business processes are under review, but we're fairly confident that we've captured all of the information elements that will be required for the model to support all 13 of these different processes. As far as when you're reviewing the form, we have identified 5 key questions that you should consider in that process. And so, is the information represented on the invoice that you send and receive support the invoice business processes that you use within your company? Is the information rule sufficient to support the business process that you use for invoicing or the various ones? Are the information elements, are there information elements that aren't present that need to be added to the model to support your business process? And that is provided in section 7 on the form. And then are there any information elements that are not part of your invoice process, but that you identify and you want to just bring it to our attention? So these are some of the key questions that you should think about as you're going through the form, and they are in the instructions of how to fill out that form. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is the form itself. So when you're filling out the form, the way it's structured, we have a drop-down for each field and suggest the change. And then each row has this comment field where you can provide additional context to the suggested change or provide additional information on the information element. We ask you to be as thorough as you can be in the comments section so that we have the right information, or we have information as we kind of take and collate all of the comments and feedback that we receive from the market so that we have that additional information in context of why the change is being requested. And so what I wanted to do real quickly before I open up for questions is, this is the form, and we have on the form, you can see the different information elements, you can see the rules, you can see the cardinality, we have this drop-down box, and then you have the comments field. But here is where you can add additional suggestions, and there's a drop-down with what we're calling information element business groups, and you can see where does this information belong as it relates to the invoice, what is the nature of the information, and any additional comments that you would want to provide. So with that, Chris, I'm going to open up the session now for question and answers. Do we have any questions? Have any questions come in?
Yes, Todd, we do have a few. The first question is from Isis. and this question is in relation to the model and whether this model is EDI or associated with EDI.
Oh, so the syntax is based off of UBL, so the ISO 85954 or 45 standard, a UBL standard, and Ken Holman, who is the co-chair of the UBL committee, will provide a little more context with that in the next part of the data model itself.
People may have also seen Jesus did clarify in the chat that it's UBL format, not an EDI message. So I'm just seeing that now. Our next question is from Clar, and that question is, what if the type of suggested change is not in, sorry, the question isn't quite flowing here. If the suggested change is not in the list of drop-down options, the form errors out if you type in the other text. So although it's been clarified in the chat, but the response to that is you can add it to the comments and observations, which is I believe that's the section at the end of the form where you can add additional items. You could also put that in the comments if it's more convenient for you as you're completing the form, but you do have two options for that. Anything else you'd add to that, Todd?
No, I think that's spot on, Chris. So if you have anything that's not in the drop-down list, put it in the comment section in the form, in that so that we capture that information that you're that you want to tell us, that you want to tell the work group.
And another question from Clar: is there a way for commenters from the same industry, in our case, utility billing, to collaborate on comments and to review each other's feedback and suggested changes?
That's a really good question. I think there's two different ways that could be approached. It could be where a group of folks within a common practice, such as utility billing practice, such as utilities, gets together and completes the form and provides that information in that manner, or what we could do is to identify those forms that come from, let's say, utility billing, and see what's common across the three of them, or across them, and then could potentially create a subgroup within the BPC invoicing workgroup to tackle that particular business process, as an example. So I think we have options there.
There are no additional questions in the Q&A at this time. If anyone else wants to post one, if you could do so in the next few seconds. Otherwise, Todd, are there a few items that you wanted to, any additional items that you wanted to cross off on at this point?
Well, I think, you know, there are some other questions that, you know, I'll just touch back on. You know, I covered them earlier on in the presentation as you're looking at the form and filling them out. You know, one question is, do I need to enter information for all of the elements or just those that need to be changed? One of the things that we considered when we were creating the feedback form is, you know, we didn't want to force people to have to change every single line. So the intention of this is only identify the ones that need change, or if you have a comment on. The rest we'll just assume are okay. So the focus of the feedback should be on only those items that need to be changed, or that you want to comment on. Otherwise, everything, we'll just assume that it's the same. So I think another question that came up, and it kind of touches on what Claire had just mentioned, is that, you know, if I have an item that's not in the dropdown, if there's a different suggestion, you know, again, throw those into the comment field to provide your perspective, so that we have that information. Don't try to add an item to that dropdown, because I think that will just make it harder for us to just try to capture that change in the form itself as we're looking through those. So we try to keep it as simple as possible for not only the folks trying to fill out the form, but also as we receive them and how to collate this information into some meaningful action afterwards. Chris, do we have any other questions that join from folks?
We have one more from Pablo. The question is, are there elements that consider interoperability or exchange with other countries?
That's a good question. When we built the model, and Jesus, do you want to answer this question?
Yes, actually, when we started to do this definition, one of my concerns and our concerns was to have all the proper fields that are required from not only Mexico, but also most of the Latin American countries on their import restrictions or requirements. So yes, it fulfills all these requirements, so they can be used for imports, of course, from the U.S. to Canada and go back and forth for exports. So yes, I review that, and we review that carefully on the standard.
And if perhaps I could add also that some of those fields include things like country of origin and tax fields, accommodating different kinds of tax regimes than are available in the U.S. These have all been incorporated into the model as well.
Great, thanks, Jesus and Ken. And that as we were doing our analysis last year of the European e-Invoice standard, we did, to Jesus and Ken's point, is we did take a very close look at what are the cross-border requirements for sending invoices between Mexico, U.S., and Canada, and so that we wanted to make sure that we did meet those requirements. So, Chris, do you have another question?
We do. The question is there an online forum or library resource for FAQs about data elements?
There is. There is an addition. If you go out to the BPC website and look in the e-invoicing section where you can get the form, there is a link to a library or to a document that'll help define what the information element is. So there is that resource available for folks as they're reviewing the form.
And that's it for questions at this time. We can continue to monitor the Q&A. Are we ready to move on to the next portion of the presentation?
I think so. And as you have more questions, feel free to submit those, and we'll answer those. We'll have some more time at the end to answer additional questions. As far as BPC activities and timeline is concerned, what we've been working on over the last couple of years is some foundational work, and this is part of that foundational work. We did an assessment of a European standard to create this North American subset. We went through and reviewed every single data element that was in or information element within that model. We reviewed all of the business processes, the business rules, the business functions, and we wrote a report and published a report at the end of last year that identified all of the different gaps or differences between what's required for the U.S. and in North America compared to that European standard. And from that, we created the model, and what you're seeing in this form is basically the items that we've identified so far. And so we've done that work. We have also gone through and assessed the technical standards for the exchange of an invoice in a four-corner model. So that creates it's a set of prescriptive standards, if you will, that allows the data exchange to happen in a common standardized way between the different service providers in that. And we're going to start, and we conducted a validation exercise of those exchange standards. And in fact, we just completed that exercise within the last week, where we were successful based off of our assessment of the different standards that are used in that data exchange. We were successful in completing a test where we were able to look across a set of federated registries on the endpoints on where to send a message to simulate the sending of an electronic invoice across various access points or service providers, let's say, within the framework. And the next thing that we're going to do is conduct a governance model assessment. And that's going to take a look at what are the different governance model frameworks that are out there or that are used for these frameworks. And we're going to create a selection criteria based off of what we see as kind of a best-in-class governance model for managing this framework over time. And then going into 2021 and through 2023, we'll go through a process of identifying a governance body, conducting an in-market pilot, and working on adoption strategies as we move this forward. So those are what the future holds for the Business Payments Coalition e-Invoice Exchange Framework Initiative. It is open for anyone to join the work. As they say, many hands lightens the work, lightens the load. So everyone is invited to join this work. I'm now going to transition and give the ball over to Ken, and Ken is going to start walking through the overview of the data model and flow. So Ken, I'm going to give you the ball.
Thank you, Todd. I've got the ball. I'm going to share screen. Yes, thank you, Todd, and thank you also to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis for their leadership in providing the facilitation for this group to get its work done. What I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes is talk about some of the technical artifacts that we as a committee are making available for anyone to analyze our semantic model at a more technical, detailed level, and even to the point where you can create documents that conform to the UBL and BPC definition and be able to test those against the constraints that we have developed so far. Because we need feedback from you as the community to tell us where we might be missing a rule or where we've incorrectly expressed a rule. Your participation in our work is vital if you're able to make it to our weekly meetings and help us as we go through the different business processes and come up with that semantic model to be used for each. In the links that you will find in these slides, you will find a link to this folder in Google where the artifacts themselves can be downloaded. And the link will bring you to a list of zip files that are dated. And please just grab the most recent one. We will probably have a few of the older versions out there for archive purposes, but grab the one with the most current date. And when you unzip that file, you will get this README file here. And in this README file is the diagram that you will find in the slides that was briefly there as Todd was passing the ball to me. And these artifacts are used by you to confirm that the data that you can create using your own processes will conform to the model. Now, I'm going to cushion that a bit. You're not obliged to create the UBL, the BPC UBL yourself, because as Todd described in a four-corner model, your organization is represented on the network by an access point service provider. And I've briefly outlined what Todd has already told you. There was a question came up about EDI. In fact, we're using the UBL specification, which is an ISO standard since 2015, ISO IEC 19845. This is an international standard semantic library for business documents. And there are now, there were 81 in 2015. I believe there are now 87 business documents. And from Clara's question, yes, there is also a business document for the utility statement that people are using globally in order to summarize utility statement information that then gets transferred to an invoice document. And that's all defined, and it's all internationally standardized as a semantic library called the Universal Business Language, UBL, and the normative syntax for UBL is XML. I'm currently co-chairing the UBL Technical Committee, and I was also the founding chairman of the XML Conformance Committee back in the late 90s. And so we brought this standard forward in the BPC as the way to represent information on that interoperability network that we are building. So I've taken the concept in Todd's diagram of the four-corner model here, and I have the document. I've tried to describe how the information from a supplier, say if corner one is the supplier, they want to send an invoice over to their buyer. And so somehow they got to have the invoice information sent over to the buyer. And the way that is done technically is that they are corner one, and they are represented on the network by corner two, their access point service provider. There is some private connection between them and their service provider. They have an ERP system of some kind. It doesn't matter to the BPC network what ERP system you have. There is some data coming out of your ERP system, and somehow through some private connection, that is given to corner two. And corner two is the supplier's representative on the network. Corner two's application code takes that data and creates an XML document following the UBL schema and the BPC constraints. That document is transported across the technical network that has been created and arrives at corner three with the intent of having the information in that XML document conveyed to the buyer, who is corner four. So you have supplier here and the buyer over here. The artifacts that we are giving to you in this zip file are these files here that corner three is using to confirm that the semantic model, and remember this XML here is the serialization of the semantic model. It is not necessarily the serialization of this ERP data, because this is in a custom format. It could be in EDI, it could be in FTP files, it could be any way at all that the ERP system wants to represent. It is the supplier's corner that's responsible for converting that into the serialization in XML of the BPC semantic model. And so what corner three has to do is confirm that the data received as XML conforms to the BPC semantic model. And when it does, then it is responsible for converting the data found in that invoice into whatever ERP system data is needed by corner 4, in this case, the buyer. This way, the supplier doesn't need to know the ERP system of the buyer, and the buyer doesn't need to know the ERP system of the supplier, because the BPC semantic model is the bridge between those two ERP systems. So to help you, the community, analyze the completeness of our semantic model, we've provided these tools so that the tools used by representative tools that could be used by a corner 3. You're not obliged to use these tools, but you are welcome to use the tools that we have here provided in the zip file. If your technical team is able to express everything they need in the XML of the semantic model, then that tells you that our semantic model is complete. But if your team cannot find a home in the semantic model for some information that is critical or crucial to you, then you've got to identify that to us so that we can analyze the requirement. The tools that we've provided for you to use run in either a Windows-based environment or a shell-based environment, and they are based on Java. So you do have to have Java running in your environment. And I've supplied in the zip file 4 XML documents that are representative of the kinds of errors that might be found in an XML document that conveys information. A syntax model means it's not well-formed XML. A model error is an indication that the document does not conform to the element names and the attribute names of the UBL International Standard. Now, if your document is well-formed and it is valid according to the model, there's still a chance that the data does not conform to the integrity constraints that we as the BPC committee have dictated for the information to be found in the invoice document. And in that case, you will get an error message, and it will tell you that the data is wrong. And if any of these cases are true, corner 3 should not be sending that invoice data to corner 4 because there is something wrong. Corner 2 should be creating the information correctly so that none of these errors happen. And I also have an example of a good instance which produces no errors. When you unzip this and you go to the val subdirectory, you can run test.bat in Windows, or you can run test.sh in shell. And this is the kind of report you get for a syntax error. This is the kind of report you get for a model, for bad data. And if your invoice is good, that is, all of the items conform to the serialization of the semantic model, you will get no schema errors, no data integrity errors. And I've also included instructions that as you create your own test instances, what you need to invoke. So Todd, I think that overviews what's available to the community to actually test, get down, fingernails dirty, working at the keyboard, trying to create the XML. But I just want to underscore that remember that live on the network, that creation is the responsibility of corner 2. You do not have to change your ERP systems to spit out UBL. Now, of course, if you are going to be your own corner 2, then of course you do have to create the UBL here. But I don't want to spook you by implying that in order to participate in the BPC that you have to change your ERP system for UBL. You do not. You just send your ERP system to your access point service provider who will take on the responsibility of creating the UBL. Thank you, Todd. You can take the ball back, or do I have to send it back to you?
Well, I just tried to grab it, and I think now I'm back to presenter. So thank you, Ken. That was great. A great overview of the tools that are available for the community to take a look at. Now, to get to these, we have included some links to the Google Drive where you can find the zip file. We've also included a link to the Semantic Model Information Elements, our spreadsheet that we're using to create the model itself. We have a link to the different business process diagrams that we are using to identify the different information element requirements to support each step within the business process. And lastly, I've included a link to where you should submit the completed form. And if you have any questions as you're filling out the form, you can submit those to the business payments or business.payments.smb@mpls.frb.org, that email address. And we monitor that email box, and we will bring those questions and comments and completed forms into the work group. And then lastly, before we conclude, I just want to see if there are any questions on Ken's part of the presentation by the community. I'll ask Chris if there's any question that have come in related to what Ken had talked about.
Doesn't appear specific to Ken, but why don't we take a question from Eric?
Okay.
He's asking, can you talk more about the adoption strategy from BPC? How well has this been received amongst the already existing providers' access points for e-invoicing, locally and globally?
Well, great question. So we've got the work group itself is a pretty fair representation of the largest e-invoice providers and networks that are operating not only in the U.S. but also globally. So from a global perspective, there's a lot of discussion around aligning these different frameworks around what they call the 4Ds. So discovery, delivery, data, which would be the semantic model, as well as directives. So what are the local rules that are driving e-invoice adoption? So the Business Payments Coalition participated in some work on what's called a global interoperability framework. So there's a lot of alignment globally on try to come up with a common way for those 4Ds that I just described to help businesses interoperate and help the service providers to interoperate to support their customers in the data exchange of an invoice, for example. And so there's a fairly a nice representation currently within the work group of the different service providers. But again, if you're a service provider that's on the phone and you're not participating in the work group, you're more than welcome to join. So is there any other questions, Chris?
Yes, one additional one from Eric. He comments that this model is great. His question is, will the interoperability, the commercial agreement, be signed between service providers, or will the agreements be signed between the access point, just a moment here, lost my place, between the access point and BPC? Also, can you speak to the receipt handling within the framework?
Well, so I'll answer the latter question first. So from a receipt handling, there's essentially, there's two different types of receipts that could potentially be used in a framework. One, there's a business receipt, did Corner for receive the invoice? Now, right now, from my understanding, there isn't a single framework in the globe that provides that level of receipt. And I know that there's some work underway between PEPL and another organization called ISPA, the European e-Invoice Service Provider Association, to come up with a common message, business message on the receipt of an invoice, the status of an invoice, et cetera. But at the technical level, when I send a message from Corner 2 to Corner 3, there is a receipt of receipt of the message saying, yes, the message was received. And so it really depends on what is meant by receipt of the message. At the technical level, yes. At the business level, that's still being worked out. Now, as far as agreements and different things like that, once a governance organization is identified and takes up the framework, then those types of decisions would be made at that level. There will be no agreement in the BPC between a service provider and, let's say, the BPC. So the Business Payments Coalition is a group of volunteers. It's not a legal entity. Chris, is there any other questions from the participants, the community?
It doesn't look like we had any last-minute ads unless we want to. We're about 3 minutes to the top of the hour unless anyone has a last-minute question. Well, otherwise, we can wrap up. Any other final comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say first, thank you to the audience for joining us today on this information and Q&A session related to the semantic model and what the informational elements are that have been identified so far, and the opportunity to comment on what has been done. It's important to get as broad a perspective as we can as we continue on creating the model, and this is a critical piece of input from the community, and we appreciate you taking the time today to listen to not only myself, but then our panel with Jesus and Ken and Mike as they support the BPC and the work that we're doing, and look forward to continuing the dialogue with the rest of you as we build the model. And the last thing I'd like to add is if you have any questions. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, just didn't mean to interrupt. If you could just advance the slide to the end with the links.
That was it. I'm on the slide with the links.
We're not seeing that.
Oh, you're not.
So we just wanted to mention that, and I think you were going to mention, any final comments can be directed to the email box.
Raven, can you give me
if
control?
You can get that. Yeah, there might be some. Just bear with us here. We'll advance that slide momentarily.
So it's not being displayed on my side?
No, it's still on slide 20.
1 second here, Todd. I'm looking for you to give you the ball back. Ken had.
Okay. All right. Let's try
okay. Yep, that's the slide. So
there you see. Okay.
As you're closing.
So let me rewind real quickly. So what Ken had covered, and this is going to be provided in the presentation. You can see the link to our Google Drive to get the zip file. You can see a link to the Semantic Model Information Elements. You can find a link here on the different business process diagrams that are available for you to review. We've got the 5 that we have done so far, and as we start working on the remaining 6, they'll be in here. And then if you have questions or when you complete the form, please email us at business.payments.smb@mpls.frb.org. So those are the links that, Chris, you're referring to. My apologies. I thought I had the ball, but apparently I must have dropped the ball. So that concludes today's information and Q&A session. Thanks again, and please reach out with questions. Thank you.